Hello guys, this is a series of videos on strategy. Today we're going to discuss the concept of business strategy. So first we have some of the oldest definitions of business strategy. The first one is from Alfred Chandler, who wrote a book called Strategy and Structure, and his quest was to find which one came first. In his conclusions, strategy comes before structure. So that explains why his definition is like this. Long-term goals that are objective sets, and then sets the resources, that's to say the structure, to achieve those goals. However, there are previous mentions of the word strategy in the business literature. Chester Barnard, who was a captain of industry who wrote this book summarizing all his experience called The Functions of the Executive, distinguished some factors that were strategic. And this is perhaps the first notion that we have of business strategy. Another one of the founding fathers of business strategy was Kenneth Andrews, who wrote one of the first textbooks in business strategy. And he defined it in a very basic way. And he defined it as a plan of action aimed at a specific result. Again, very basic, but still a bit of truth there. Now, it really gets interesting in the 1990s and 1980s, where Michael Porter developed his definition for strategy. And in ways that actually had not been done before, he presents concepts as organizational resources, skills, competencies that are combined in such a way that you create competitive advantage. Strategy then needs to be communicated as an organization unique position. This, which may sound like common sense to you, was quite innovative for the time it was done. And actually, it broke a little bit what had been done before with plans and so on. For the first time, strategy is seen as a competitive tool. And why is that? Because Michael Porter bases his work on industrial organization, which explains how companies compete in monopolistic competition or oligopolistic competition. In a way to synthesize all these definitions, we find that the famous textbook by Jerry Johnson just defines strategy as the long-term direction of an organization. It doesn't go into whether it's plans or whether it's something that the company is doing to compete. But it tells us that it covers both emergent and planned strategies. Now, all these definitions stress the purpose and the time dimension, and they distinguish functional, business, and corporate level strategy. Now, no matter which definition you take, these are the founding elements of strategy. Having looked at these definitions from the past, I would invite you to draw a definition of strategy of your own, in your own words. Now, in order to define strategy, you will need to take into consideration all these elements. First, and perhaps most important, there's an element of temporality. You decide on things today that will happen in the future, and nobody knows the future, so there's no exact science here. Then the decisions come, and the decisions are decisions you make today for things that will happen in the future. Strategy is made of decisions, so it's a set of decisions that you make today of things that will happen in the future. Now, you will also need to consider goals. Goals deal with what you want to achieve, obviously. And now, all this is done in a context, and the context is an organization with individuals and resources. And you have to decide how this organization will be shaped. And one of the main elements of organizations are how many levels you have. Do you want to have a flat organization like an orchestra? Or you want to have an organization that has many levels, like the army, for example. And finally, there's an element of purpose. Strategy exists because you're trying to achieve a purpose. It's purposeful action, which doesn't necessarily mean that you're strictly going towards a single goal, but your actions and decisions aim at a purpose. Now you may be wondering, why is there not a single definition? Is that a problem? Is that something that we have to deal with and come up with a definition? No. Probably one of the wisest academics in the field said that strategy is an open field, not a closed gauge. So strategy means many things to different people. Strategy is a multidimensional concept, and for this reason, strategy as a field can be mapped, but it cannot be defined. And it's a good thing that it cannot be defined. And that's why I asked you to form your own minds as to what is the best definition. Now, it doesn't really matter what definition you have, as long as it has the elements that we discussed before. All those elements put together combine into a configuration that helps you achieve goals by structuring your own business. So it's for you to develop your own mind map and learn what strategy is and what strategy is not. And this is what this course is about. As I mentioned before, one of the biggest thinkers in strategy is Henry Mintzberg, whom I have the pleasure of having met personally, and he's an incredibly clever guy. One of the ways that he dealt with this lack of one definition of strategy was looking at strategy as a field, as if you were going to a safari, and in this safari you saw different animals. So the way he describes strategy is as different authors address it. And he divided the whole field into these 10 schools. I would invite you to have a look at the Strategy Safari book. It's really worth looking into, or even if you read over it or skim over it, it will always be interesting what you find. Because what Mintzberg describes are different drivers for strategy. The typical driver that we all study is positioning, which is mostly developed by Michael Porter. But there are other drivers, like learning or design or how it affects cognition. Well, you will see that strategy is a huge field that has many lenses, and it takes you several years to understand what strategy is. And it doesn't matter if there's no single definition. It's one of the beauties of strategic management, that there's no single definition and that it means different things because it's a multidimensional concept. Probably following on Mintzberg's lead, Richard Whittington, who is one big name in strategy and he's in the UK, he wrote one of the first books he wrote is What is Strategy and Does It Matter? Again, trying to aim at this definition. And of course, he couldn't find a single definition. So he distinguished 4 drivers for strategy. The classic, in which you define a goal and then you try to achieve the goal. The processual, which is more bottom-up, more messy and more adaptive. You can think of companies like Google when it started, that it was a bit of a messy thing trying to come up with something and they didn't actually know what it was. They do know now though. The evolutionary approach, in which the market tends to drive companies to move in one way or another. For example, Nokia. Nokia started as a roll paper company, became the biggest mobile phone company in the world, and then failed. And finally, systemic, in which you have a pluralistic organizational goal that drives the organization. You can think of bigger institutions worked based on systems. All these approaches try to map the field, and what I have invited you to do is to map the field yourselves. But what we learn from this is that there's an element of flexibility in strategy, and it needs to be crafted, and it needs to be responsive to the environment. All those things come into play. And rather than learning the definition, you better learn to use it. I always use the example that strategy is like riding a bicycle. Even if I try to explain to you how to do it, unless you use it, unless you ride the bicycle, you will never learn it. So rather than thinking how to define it, put all your efforts in trying to use it, and the definition will come as a conclusion to that. I know it causes some sort of anxiety, especially for undergraduate students, that there is no definition. But rather than focusing on the anxiety, what you should do is learn how to use it, like you learn how to ride a bike. And you will fall several times. And hopefully after a couple of times that you fall down, then you'll be able to manage it much better. That will happen with strategy. Just play with it confidently and you will get there sooner than you think. I personally like to think of strategy like climbing a Scottish mountain, like the image you have in front of you. Different to the image that you have in front of you, when you climb a Scottish mountain, most of the times the weather is not nice and you don't see the summit. You actually don't see your feet sometimes. But you carry on climbing, and as long as the slope is going upwards, you must be going in the right direction. Also, you're not alone. You're with friends or colleagues, and you're trying to find a way together. That's pretty much the way strategy is. You try your best and try to make decisions for the future, and you learn as you go along. I know it produces anxiety, and you think, well, why am I learning this strategy thing? It's not going to take me anywhere, and there's no recipe. No, there's no recipe, because it deals with decisions being made today about problems that will happen in the future, and nobody can foresee the future. So in that temporality is where strategy occurs, and because it occurs in that temporality, you have to deal with uncertainties and many things that you cannot manage, but you still have to make the decisions today in order to try to achieve a goal, and then you adjust it as you go along. If you think about it, is in many ways the way we manage our lives. Yeah, of course we hope for the best, we put all the resources in place, but there are some uncertainties and some things that happen that are not expected, and when these things happen that are not expected, you just adjust. That is the way strategy works. As a multidimensional concept, strategy has different levels. The basic one is decision support, in which you want to encourage unity and consistency across the organization. But it's also a coordinating device. As you discuss decisions with other members of the organization, then you agree on how you will get along and who will do which part. So it also works as a coordinating device. It sets targets, and as it sets targets, it mobilizes the organization to achieve those targets. So the target is a driver. And finally, it's a motivator, because companies who have high aspirations, then performance leads to achieving those high aspirations. So strategy is these four things at the same time. In order to end this episode of the definitions of strategy, I want to point you into one of the best books I've read on strategy. And it was written by this very impressive professor who worked all his life in strategic management. And towards the end of his life, he wrote this no-nonsense book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. His name is Dick Rumelt, as you see at the bottom, and in chapter 5, he describes some basic elements of good strategy. The first basic element is that strategy is about understanding how the environment works and how competitors work. That will give you a diagnosis of the challenge. If the competitors are very good, then it's going to be a tough place out there. And if the environment is very competitive, is it worth it to go and do your business there? Second, you need strategy as a guiding policy for dealing with the problems that may come up. If something emerges that you didn't expect, then how do you adapt? Well, you look at the target. Where am I heading to? And then if we want to arrive to X, then how should we go about it? It's a constant way to guide your policy and to renew it if needed. And finally, it's a set of coherent actions, coherent between individuals and coherent within the organization, that determine what should we do and when should we do it. I also suggest you read this book. At least read chapter 5. It's a fabulous book. And again, as I said, there's no nonsense there. It's very straight to the point. So much so that the book is called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. And on that note, we end up the episode on definitions of strategy. And the message is, it doesn't matter that there's no single definition. Understanding strategy is not about learning a definition, but about learning how to use it. And all these elements come to play. And unfortunately, there's a level of anxiety because you're dealing with incomplete information in uncertain environments. And that's where strategy matters.